Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast brought to you on Fulfill Radio right here each Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. Central and 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're delighted to be with you today. With me is Dr. Don Preston. And Don, how are you doing? Is it storming in Oklahoma? Because we are about to get some storms here in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, I told you you'd be getting the weather that we had been getting. So pardon me, that has indeed come true. But no, as a matter of fact, it started out the day just cold. The wind has been howling. I'm talking absolutely howling. And I had to take Jan to Oklahoma City to the doctor today to do some more follow-up testing. She had gotten some kind of troubling results on some blood work the other day, and kind of concerned us. And so anyway, she had her regular doctor's appointment up there, which, thank the good Lord, turned out to be great. No problems at all. But anyway, the weather all the way up there was just, just unbelievable wind. And we got up there, it was cold, and then we got home, and the wind was still blowing, but it turned off 72 degrees. So it's been that way ever since we got home, and they claim it's supposed to be a beautiful day tomorrow.
Well, good. Well, they're saying here that we're going to get some storms, serious storms, a little bit later, around 8 or so tonight. So if you're in the Memphis area, be careful out there. Weather projections don't look good for the present. And right now, however, it's pretty nice. It's cloudy and looks like rain is coming. For the most part, the day was nice. A little overcast, but other than that, it was pretty good. It's now beginning to get hot, so we'll probably get those showers a little bit later.
Well, it's just that time of year, right here in Oklahoma, starting about this time of year, going through May. It's that time of year where thunderstorms can arise at the drop of a hat. Tornadoes can come through and just take everything away. And so it's just good to be alert and aware this time of year. And normally, as we were saying and suggesting, everything that hits here moves toward you. And last week we had all that horrible rain. I say horrible, we needed it tremendously. But we had very, very heavy rain and bad weather and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's just that time of year.
Yeah, well, Judy Garland and the Wizard of Oz, they're like next door to you, right?
Yeah. Seemingly so. I haven't seen the glass slippers, but I can tell you we've seen plenty of the tornadoes nonetheless.
Yeah.
And they can get pretty scary. Our son in Oklahoma City lives right directly, I'm talking directly in the middle of what they call Tornado Alley in the Norman, Oklahoma area, which is immediately south of Oklahoma City. And over the last 10 years, they've had two massive tornadoes. One tornado was literally 1 mile wide, if you can imagine. And it had sustained winds in its vortex of 275 miles per hour. It was a Category 4 plus, Category 5, and it just wiped out a swath of homes, businesses, churches, buildings. I mean, it was just the most devastated area that you could possibly imagine. And he lives right there, I mean, literally right in the middle of the pathway. So every time there's a storm, we're calling him and saying, have you left yet? Have you have you found a hole in the ground somewhere? It's really scary.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can imagine that's just scary to even think about, to be in the pathway of potentially mile-wide tornadoes. And, man, at 200 plus miles an hour with debris, I mean, that's like running into a Mack truck, or worse. That's
it's a whole lot worse than that. I mean, there were humongous buildings up there that had stood for years and years, and they were literally gone. It was as if you had come in with a wrecking crew and ball and chain, leveled it to the ground, and swept the foundation clean. I mean, literally not one stone left standing on top of another. It was just, my wife and I didn't go up there until several months after the storm. They didn't want even people traveling through on the interstate, which of course it was difficult to prevent. But we stayed away for a couple of months. Even a couple of months afterwards, the carnage was it's difficult to imagine. I mean, it really is not only difficult to imagine, but it's almost impossible to describe for anyone that has never seen the damage that a tornado can cause. Some of the strangest things that you can possibly imagine. I mean, it's one of the strangest phenomena in nature to witness what a tornado can do. It really is. It
just rearranges the whole topography and restructures buildings and everything else. Has cars stuck up in trees. I hear all kinds of things.
Well, one of the things, and then we'll move on, but one of the things that was so astounding was a house. It was a 2-story house, and they showed this on the news. It had been I would almost call it a palatial house, and again, 2-story. And there was a column left standing of bricks that extended from, obviously, the ground level all the way up. There was still a piece of the ceiling left, and in the bedroom, upstairs bedroom, there was still a small coffee table sitting where it had been sitting prior to the storm. The bed was gone, the room was gone, and sitting on that coffee table, nightstand, was a glass of water with the water still in it. The table was untouched, the glass was untouched, the water was untouched. The rest of the house, except that one column, was gone. And, you just go, that's not even possible. But they showed it on TV. It was astounding. Really was.
Yeah, very, very amazing. Just devastating. Well, we hope that, things will be safe for people this year, that, we can avoid some of the devastation that's happened But, it's the weather, and the weather does what the weather does.
Yeah. Well, William, what's going on with you ministry-wise? I know that you've been up to your eyeballs in a written exchange. I don't even know if you could call it a debate with Jason DaCosta over the Israel-only issue. It's really distressing and disturbing and discouraging to a certain extent to watch his video. I don't even know if you'd call it a video. But as we suggested last week, he really spends a distressing amount of time doing nothing but insulting you, insulting anyone that would reject what he has to say, exalting his learning, magnifying his logic, praising his integrity, and again, questioning the integrity, questioning the mental capacity, and certainly questioning almost the humanity of anyone that would dare to question the things that he, in his imminent wisdom, has come up with. And yet, you were kind enough to send me a manuscript for one of your presentations that you gave, and the logic in that was absolutely fantastic. The argument was just as solid as it can be. And I've interacted with some of these IO people before, these Israel-only people before. They've never been able to answer these arguments. The last time that I seriously engaged any of them was a guy by the name of Michael Byrus that you also have engaged with. And when I shared at that time some of the material that you presented in your paper, he literally abandoned the discussion. And I suspect that's happened in other Facebook discussions as well. And it's so distressing to me that you have people out there that are falling for a doctrine that, number one, is so godless, it's so hopeless, and it is such a distortion of the biblical data. It is such a manipulation of sound logic, and yet it's passing itself off as the only truth. Now, I don't have a problem at all challenging, quote, orthodoxy, unquote. I don't have a problem at all challenging church tradition as such. I do that all the time. You do that all the time. But it truly is distressing that when you have a doctrine here that violates every lexicon, violates every Hebraeus that's ever lived, violates every known doctrine of gospel, grace in the Bible, and then it's passed off so arrogantly, then it really makes you stop and wonder, what is there about this that is causing people, anyone, to be attracted to it? It's such an anachronistic doctrine. So anyway, tell us just a little bit about your interactions here.
Well, first of all, let me just say that I don't know that the summarization of DaCosta and the movement and what's going on with it couldn't have been done by anyone any better than what you've just stated. Our interactions has been rather spotty because I did, present a challenge to him, but my intentions were that we would have a reasonable discussion. At the time, there was a discussion going on with Michael Miano and Michael Bradley. And so I didn't want to interfere with that. However, there was a lot of going back and forth. And so, I was trying to hit the tail end of that so we could begin at least some negotiations. But when I did send that, it came back with the video and a lot of all the things that you just described. And so, and also with some terms that even DaCosta mentioned that he wouldn't have accepted himself, which indicated that he wasn't serious about having a discussion. And so there was no way I was going to agree to them. My intentions were that he, whatever proposition, as you and I have always done, when we engage in debate, we give the person the opportunity to tweak and, adjust their proposition to what they feel comfortable in defending. And then we come to an agreement on the two propositions so that they can be defended. But this was supposed to be, sort of a lopsided discussion that he was going to control. He basically said that. He says, if we're going to do it my way. Well, that threw up red flags from the beginning, to even assume, that kind of control in a discussion where you're trying to, get after truth. But at any rate, so I just decided to respond to what he did. And my first response was a 29-page response. And of course, there were complaints about that. But, since that time, there have been 4 videos that he produced to respond to that. And he wasn't even done. As you say, most of his videos were filled with just a lot of ranting back and forth and castigating us and other people who disagreed with him. So it was hard to pick that apart. What I did eventually do, however, was I transcribed all of his material. So I have every single speech that he has transcribed. And when you look through that, you almost have to pick like you're picking through the needles through a haystack to find where he does actually get around to making an argument. And when he does, it's not a very good one for the most part. And so I responded to that. I got, lots of good feedback from the post, and others have been posting it and commenting on it. And then I decided after he responded, I would do another response, and I just posted that one today. So it is on my Facebook page, or you can, it'd probably be difficult to find it on my website because I posted it as a PDF, but the link is on my Facebook page on All Things Fulfilled. I also posted it in this new website that is online called Hot Potatoes. I thought that was an interesting name, but it's posted there as well. And if you contact me, I'll be happy to send it to you. Dunn reviewed it. Holger Neubauer reviewed it, and both of them thought that it was a very good response. And so I went ahead and posted it tonight. And so I haven't heard back from people regarding it just yet, other than a few comments that were made. But I think it addressed many of the concerns that were raised in some of the things that he said. It wasn't meant to be exhaustive. There's a lot more that I have to say on the subject. If I respond again, since there's not really a formal debate, if I respond again, it'll be something more brief because I've dealt with many of the things that have gone unanswered. But I do feel that it was a very good engagement in terms of allowing some things to be presented that were not being presented and addressed that were not being addressed in the way that I felt that they should. And I'm hopeful that it will give people a little bit more confidence and information in dealing with them. One of the things that I noticed was that there have been some people who were kind of on the fence of what direction they were going, or they were, leaning heavily toward that. Some of these people are now strongly disagreeing with the IO position and are now actually advocating against it and using some of the material that I've presented. I also did a video in response to some comments that were made by Michael Bradley on the word telos. And I think you and I talked about that a little bit on last week. And we talked about telos being, a goal to be reached for the most part, the consummation of a thing, but it didn't mean the end of everything that was involved. And especially in this case, where you have the time of the end, where you're dealing with the end of the old covenant, but you're also presenting, at least God was, the inauguration and establishment of the new covenant. And by establishing it, we mean to confirm it, to make it firm and stand, to fulfill all the things that were necessary for it to come into being. And that's the major error that I see with the Israel-only position. On the one hand, they are trying very hard to end everything, but they can't bring themselves to actually agree with their own premise. As a matter of fact, speaking of Michael Bradley, he raised that issue of 1 Peter 4:7 and said the end of all things is at hand, and he sort of put that out as a challenge to us using the word telos. Well, you have a form of that word used in Matthew 24. What's in Matthew 24, but it's also in the parable of the tares in Matthew 13, where you clearly have the end of the tares and being burned and consumed, but you also have the kingdom continuing. And so if he's going to make, for example, the word telos to mean end, then what is he going to do with the text that says there is no end of the kingdom? So I find them often in some of their major arguments being diametrically opposed to the scriptures, where they're saying one thing, like everything is going to end, and then here's God saying this will never end. And I'm saying, how are they missing this? They ask that question a lot about us, claiming how are we missing it? But that's how we're missing it, because of the fact that these things will never end. And so they try to find explanations, like the one that's being purported now or presented on Isaiah 65 and 66, that all of this happened at the time of the return from Babylonian captivity. And I'm just shaking my head at that one and just saying, how can you even suggest that? But again, one other point I'll make, and that is even today, I think Michael Bradley posted some comment about people believing in hell. He says, why does the regular Christian or something to that effect even talk about hell if they don't believe it exists? And I'm saying to myself, well, why, the question that you and I have asked a lot, why are they even talking about anything related to the Bible when they claim all of it's over? And so I find that to be a very big contradiction in their claim, because they're asking for love, they're asking for miracles, they're asking for hope, they're asking for everything. As a matter of fact, Michael Bradley even made the statement that we can have just about everything that Israel had without the redemption and without the revelation. And I just thought, really, is this even possible? But anyway, that's what it is. So I think that it's been a good exchange as far as allowing us to bring out some points that maybe other people have not seen, or that we don't have. We've been just kind of bantering back and forth in Facebook, but now it's in a document where people can go and read it and use it as a tool and resource to have. And I'm thinking about maybe publishing some more information on that. But I probably will do one more response, depending on what response comes from that, because there are a few other things that I wanted to say, and then I'll just leave it alone. Because I think there's a sufficient amount of information that's out there for anyone who is thinking and reasonable to address.
Well, I know that one of the things that you developed there in your paper, and by the way, send me a link to that because I'll share it on my Facebook as well. But anyway, one of the things that I saw early on, I saw this early last year, and I began developing it, and you and I talked about it when I shared it with you. You obviously saw the power of it, but I presented it simply under the heading of it's the end of all things, the beginning of all things, because that struck me as fundamentally, just a major, major challenge to the IO position. As you just delineated there, they're taking the view that the end of all things means there's nothing after that. But the consistent story of biblical eschatology is, point number one, was there an end? Well, absolutely. But it was the end of the Old Covenant age. But at the same time, as the Old Covenant age was passing away, the Old Covenant of sin and death and condemnation, at the same time, it was the full establishment, as you just said, of the new heaven and the new earth, where anyone and everyone is welcome to come in, where what God said under the Old Covenant, even when he was dealing exclusively, to use that term, with Israel, even during that period of time, Yahweh said, I think it's Deuteronomy chapter 10, if I'm not mistaken, actually there are several passages in the Old Testament in which Yahweh said that he loved the foreigners. He loved strangers. and he called on Israel to love strangers. Well, if
Michael
that was
Bradley,
true...
Michael Bradley quoted that very text. It was just good to me. I couldn't believe it. But he quoted that very text. But anyway, go ahead. I know I interrupted your flow, but I just had to say that.
No, that's fine. I can't believe that one of the IO people would quote that passage. I mean, here's a text that says that God, even under the Old Covenant system, in which God said, I have loved Israel and Israel only, and yet at the same time he says, I love the foreigners, I love the strangers. And if a stranger wants to come in, let him obey the Torah, and he will be as a native-born son, according to Exodus chapter 12. So, anyway, that concept of the end of all things and the beginning of all things, and I mentioned Michael Byers a few moments ago, in the last exchange that I had over the issue, is I pointed out, and I admittedly misunderstood what he had said, and I posted a response to it, and I was in a real hurry. I was anxious to get out. I was about to leave, and I wasn't paying attention. Well, Michael Byers posted back, and boy, he thought he had me nailed to the wall. Well, if I would have meant what he took me to say, and if I would have meant what I typed, yeah, then he would have had me. I must admit that. But I didn't type what I intended to type. You know how that happens sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I clarified it, I said, I fully understand, Michael, where you thought I had made a major blunder. So I apologize for the misunderstanding. But let me clarify and let me state clearly what I was trying to communicate but failed to do so. Point number one, Revelation chapter 20 depicts the destruction of the old heaven and earth. That's the old heaven and earth of Old Covenant Israel. That's the end of all things. But chapter 21 is a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. This is the new creation, and it comes down from God out of heaven for God to dwell with man. That's a direct violation of everything that Israel-only people stand for, because by and large, the most of them accept and believe and advocate a literal rapture. God took all of Israel off of the earth. That's the end. It's over. Kaput. There is no God dwelling with man on earth. But as I pointed out, and I had repeated this motif throughout many of our discussions, nothing could be clearer in Revelation 20 through 22 than the fact that God was presenting the idea that everything about the old was coming to an end. But the new, which was Israel's hope, and which was the hope of the nations, by the way, according to Haggai chapter 2, verse 6, the hope of the nations was now coming true. So, yes, it's the end of all things. It is the beginning of all things. And again, I saw that this was a fundamental issue a good long while back, and so I was obviously thrilled when you developed it as excellently as you did in that paper that you were telling us about. Because I'm telling you what, folks, this is the death of Israel-only doctrine. On the one hand, as William was pointing out, they want to talk about it's the end. The end means end. End means end. But then when Jesus said that the gospel was never going to end, they have it ending. And so their only definition is it comes to an end. Even though the emphatic words of the New Testament is there was something coming in that would have no end. And that was the rule and the reign of Christ, Luke 1, 32 and 33. It was the gospel of Jesus Christ, Matthew 24, verse 35. And William, you know, in some of the interactions that I had with Jason DaCosta on his Facebook page before he booted me off of the page and unfriended me over, obviously, some of the things that I was pointing out, is I just asked him, Jesus said his gospel would never end. Are you saying that the gospel did in fact end, even though Jesus said it would never end? And he wrote back and he said, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Well, let me tell you what, folks. Anytime that a man has to take the emphatic, explicit words of Jesus, where he said, my word will never pass away, and you have to stand in the face of God, you have to stand in the face of Jesus and say, well, obviously what you meant there was your gospel will only stand for 40 years, and it will pass away in 40 years. In contrast to the law of Moses that stood for 1,500 years. Boy, that's a pretty poor that's a pretty poor record.
Well, look,
so, anyway.
I just have to put this quote out there that came from Michael Byers today. He said, we are under the laws of our country, state, and municipality. That's about it. So that wraps up I.O. for you.
Yeah. Under no law of God.
Exactly.
God. Well, as I pointed out many, many times in my correspondence with him, then if that's the truth, then God's moral character has ceased to exist. I even asked Michael Byers over and over and over, has God's moral character, has God's moral attributes of hating that which is unclean, hating that which is immoral, hating that which is hateful, has God's moral character gone out of business? And he repeatedly said, no, it has not. Now he is saying, yes, it has. So God, who said, and Scripture that says, I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. So God lied. He is not the same today as he was before AD 70, when he hated sin, when he hated the works of the flesh, and he said that those who practice the works of the flesh would never enter into the kingdom. And yet God changed. God changed and said, you know what? Those who practice those things did not enter the kingdom, but now there's no kingdom for you to enter into, so it doesn't matter if you do those things or not anyway. I've changed my attitude. I have a totally indifferent attitude about whether you lie, you steal, you commit adultery, you commit fornication, you covet. God says, hey, I'm totally indifferent about those things.
God's name in vain.
That's exactly right. I mean, just have at it, because I don't care. Even though I always did, I don't care anymore. I mean, this is... I wrote to someone on YouTube before we came on air. This person had inquired, what in the world is this IO doctrine? And I just wrote back. I said, it is an absolutely godless, absolutely hopeless, absolutely unbiblical doctrine. That's what Israel-only doctrine truly is. And there's no other way to describe it. Again, the logical fallacies, the abuse. You know, I was interacting with one of the leaders of the Israel-only movement some years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago now. We were corresponding via emails, and we were arguing over the meaning of the word foreigner and stranger.
I remember those.
In the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. And I pointed out, okay, in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, you have allogenes, which is other born, other blood, allophili, which means other tribe, not of the tribe, and allotrios, foreigner. And I said, and I pointed out, okay, these words can have nuances. If Israel was dwelling in a land that was not theirs, then they were foreigners in that land. They were foreigners to those people. They were not of the blood of those people. They were not of the tribes of those people. And again, they were foreigners to those people. But when God said he was going to save the foreigners, he was speaking to Israel about people that were foreigners to them, and that they were not of the tribes of Israel. And I cited several of the texts. And I said, your doctrine is completely distorting and perverting the lexicographical meaning and the contextual meaning, therefore, of all of these words. And his response to me was, well, Don, you and I both know that if we would have depended on, and if we would have gone to the lexicons, we would never have ever become preterists. And I wrote back and I said, that is absolutely 100% false. I have never said that. I have never thought that. I have never believed that. On the contrary, it was when I saw, for instance, that the lexicons define aeon as age and not world, that my head began to spin around on my shoulders in Matthew 24. It was when I saw the meaning of words like mellow, about to be, in the lexicons, that I realized that there was a problem with traditional eschatologies. And we can just give, on and on, pardon me, on with the examples that could be given of how when we saw the proper meaning of the words used in the New Testament, the proper definitions as given by the lexicons and the grammars, and a prime case in point. I remember to this day sitting in my office in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and I had my King James, I had my American Standard, New American Standard Bibles open, and I had really been struggling. I could see all of these time statements that the day of the Lord was near 2,000 years ago. And boy, I was really, really struggling with that. In my mind going, well, if the day of the Lord was near 2,000 years ago, how in the world can I hang on? How in the world can I say the day of the Lord has not come 2,000 years later? I knew that any appeal to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, a day is with the Lord 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day. I knew that was not a valid answer to all of the time statements in Scripture. That's just a nonsensical argument from desperation. So I had come to the point where I was hanging my hat on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul said, we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together to him. And by the way, the word gathering there is a word that when I went to the lexicons and I saw what the lexicons did with that word, it was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. I thought I knew what that word meant. Anyway, we beseech you by our gathering together to him that you do not be soon shaken in your mind by word or by epistle, as if from us, that the day of the Lord was just at hand. Well, that's the good old King James translation. So I had come to a point in my studies, in my struggles, of saying, okay, there was a day of the Lord that was at hand. That was AD 70. That was clearly the fall of Jerusalem. But wait, hang on. Paul said, don't let anyone deceive you that the day of the Lord has come, or is just at hand. And I was going, see, there was an at-hand coming of the Lord. There was a not-at-hand coming of the Lord. So I read my King James, reached over there with the American Standard. See, same translation. And then I looked at my New American Standard. And I very often have, as you do, several translations laid out on the desk, but happen to have the New American Standard, I think it was. And I read it, and it do not be soon shaken in mind, whether by word or by epistle as if from us, that the day of the Lord had already come. And William, I got to tell you, I right there in my desk, Shawnee, Oklahoma, I was shaken to my roots. I was shaken to my very foundation because I knew in a moment, in an instant, may I use the term, in a twinkling of an eye, I knew that my traditional concept of the day of the Lord would not fit that text. How in the world could anyone convince anyone that my traditional concept of the day of the Lord had already come and was in the past? I knew that was wrong. Well, immediately I went to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 18. Hymenaeus and Philetus overthrow the faith of some, saying that the resurrection has already come. Wait a minute. My concept of the resurrection was the day of the Lord, when every person who had ever died, decomposed, returned to the dust. Every person who had died in the sea and been eaten by the fish of the sea would somehow, some way, miraculously be reconstituted and restored, raised out of the dust of the earth, raised out of the oceans, and brought back to life. But wait a minute. How could anybody believe that that was already past? So I'm going, wait a minute. What do the lexicons say about this word that is translated as at hand in the King James and already come in the New American Standard? So I grabbed my grammars. I grabbed the lexicons. And I realized that, as the grammars point out, this text in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is the Greek word enestekin. It's in the perfect tense, meaning has come and arrived, is present. Has come and is present. That's the force of the perfect tense. And it's only used like 7 or 8 other times in the entire New Testament in the perfect tense, and in every single other occurrence. There's no question in the translations how the translators rendered it. They contrast it with things past and things present, like in Romans 8, 32 to 34. I am convinced that neither things past or things present are able to separate us from the love of God. Things present or things to come, excuse me. Every single time the perfect tense of enestemi is used, it means has come and is present. Now, my point in this is it was through the lexicons, through the grammars, that I came to understand that my traditional views of eschatology were wrong. I did not have to reject the lexicons. I did not have to challenge the grammars. I accepted what they said. And here was one of the leading representatives of the Israel-only movement telling me that the only way for him to sustain his doctrine was to reject the lexical evidence, reject the grammars, and just basically make up our own definition of whatever we think it ought to be, based upon our supposedly newly discovered doctrine. And yet that doctrine violates allotrios, allophuli, and allogenes. That doctrine violates those 3 words, period. And when I told him that, and by the way, a little anecdote here, further anecdote, I pointed out that at the temple at Jerusalem, that there was the court of the Gentiles, and it was the court of the ethnoi, nations. Then there was the court of Israel. Standing between the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations, where, by the way, anyone and everyone was welcome to be. That's kind of like 2 Kings 8:41, where Solomon said, if anyone of any nation who is not of the seed of Israel wishes to come to this place and to this temple and offer up prayers and sacrifices to you, O Lord, grant that any of his wishes, grant that all of his prayers be granted. Israel understood that people not of the tribes of Israel were supposed to be welcomed at the temple at Jerusalem. Thus, they had the court of the nations, then they had the court of Israel. Now, the court of Israel is where the 12 tribes are welcome. The court of the nations is for those who are not of the tribes of Israel. And standing between these two courts was a balustrade, a wall, approximately 3 feet tall. And every so often, on that wall was a plaque with the inscription that said, any foreigner that goes beyond this point will bear the responsibility for his own death. Now, Josephus reported that, and in the 19th century, in excavations in Jerusalem, they found some of those plaques with the inscriptions on it. And I asked this advocate of Israel only, did Israel of Paul's day know the difference between an Israelite of the diaspora, for instance, and a member of the nations not of Israel, not of the tribes of Israel? Now remember, when Paul in Acts chapter 21 went to Jerusalem, and he was at the temple, and the Jews realized that he had a Greek with him, a Greek by the name of Trophimus. They jumped to the conclusion that Paul had taken him into the court of Israel. Now, wait a minute. Look, folks, if he is a member of the 12 tribes, he has a right to go into the court of Israel. But he's a Greek, and his place is in the court of the nations. So the Jews at the temple imagined that Paul had taken a Greek, not an Israelite, a Greek, into the temple area court of Israel. They immediately grabbed hold of him and began to try to kill him. It was only when Lysias, the centurion, rescued him that he was saved from death. And Paul himself said, I was at the temple, I was not violating the temple, I was not breaking any law. Now, what that means is, Paul did not take a Greek into the court of Israel. He was in the court of the nations, where he had a perfect right to be. And the Jews jumped to the wrong conclusion. So when I asked this Israel-only proponent, did those Jews not understand the difference between an Israelite and someone who was not an Israelite? And he said, that testimony means absolutely nothing. When I was talking about the wall, he said, that's history, that's not Bible. But I said, the story of Paul and Trophimus is the Bible, and you have to explain it in light of the history. And I said, the Bible was not written in a vacuum. Why would they seek to destroy Paul for trying to take a member of the 10 tribes or any of the 12 tribes Why would they try to kill Paul for doing that? The man, if he was an Israelite in any shape, form, or fashion, he had a right to be in the court of the Israelites. But they didn't believe this man had a right to be in the court of the Israelites. And I'm telling you, this is such an incredibly powerful story in Acts 21. And I haven't seen any answer to that anywhere by the Iowa people. But I mean, when we understand the force of that plaque, when we understand the Jews of the day, when we understand all of that and put Acts 21 in that historical temple context, then guess what, folks? That's extremely powerful. And by the way, going back to 2 Kings chapter 8, that non-Israelite may not be able to go into the court of Israel, but he can go to the temple, and he's a foreigner, and God loves him. Deuteronomy 10. And he can come to the temple, and he can pray, and he can receive answers to his prayer. And by keeping Torah, he can become as a native-born son. He can become an Israelite. By the way, the rabbis had a saying. The rabbis said, when a Gentile, and by Gentile they meant someone, they most assuredly did not mean someone of the 10 northern tribes that had been scattered abroad. That's not who they had in mind. They knew the difference. John chapter 10, 35 and following, or 34 and following, is very clear evidence that the Jews in Judea knew who the diaspora were. They knew where they were. And the diaspora was among the nations. Just go to that's John chapter 7, 34 and following. I'm having a brain burp there, William. I may have to look that up. So anyway, the chapter 7, yeah. Chapter 7. Well,
I'll get it for you. Just keep going.
Okay, yeah. Well, anyway.
Verse 35.
So the Jews, 7:35?
Mm-hmm.
No, 10:35. Boy, I hate when that happens.
You want 10:35?
Yeah, when Jesus said, "I am going away, and where I go, you cannot come." And
well, now that's John 8, and that's John 7. Remember? Let me read the text. Then Jesus said to
I'm
them,
sorry. Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. For some reason, I was in Luke, evidently.
Yeah, I will be with you a little while longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. Then the Jews said among themselves, where does he intend to go, that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?
Right. Now, see, here is a very prime example in which there's a delineation between the diaspora, that's the 10 northern tribes, and the Greeks. That is, the nations. Here it is Hellenese, if memory serves me correctly. But the point of fact is, in this passage, the diaspora, the 10 northern tribes, are not the Gentiles. They're not the Greeks. And so when we put all of this together, and we see that God, even under the Tanakh, even under Torah, loved the foreigners, invited the foreigners to come to the temple and to pray, invited the foreigners to keep the law and be blessed. But I was saying a few moments ago that even the rabbis had a saying. If a man who is a Gentile, when he is circumcised and baptized, he becomes in every way a child of Abraham and an Israelite. Now look, those were the rabbis who also said there are three things that God hates: women, Samaritans, and Gentiles. Now, I don't know whatever possessed those rabbis to say God hates women, but you know, I'm just reporting the news here, okay? but that there was that saying in ancient Israel to suggest that the ancient Jews did not know what Gentiles were. They knew who the Samaritans were, didn't they? They knew what women were, didn't they? And right here in John 7.
They even knew how to determine a person by their speech.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to suggest that the Jews had no understanding of who the pagan Gentiles were, and that even God obviously didn't know who the pagan Gentiles were when he said he was going to save the nations and invite the nations to come and to worship and to be saved and blessed. I mean, after all, maybe God didn't even know who the foreigner was when he said that he loved the foreigner and the strangers. I mean, maybe God was confused there, and really all in the world that he really honestly meant was, I just love Israel. It's not what it says. And so this is what we mean, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about this Israel only, rejecting the lexical definitions of the biblical words. Then when they come to places like John chapter 7, they have to completely ignore the testimony that in the mind of the Jews of Jesus' day, there was a very clear delineation between the diaspora and the Gentiles. You know, and how do we draw a distinction between the Gentiles in John chapter 7, in which the Jews understood the distinction? Let's make sure we emphasize this. And then in Acts chapter 10, when Peter went into the household of Cornelius, and the very first thing he said was, "You do know it's not lawful for a man that is a Jew to eat or to have company with a man that's a Gentile." Do you mean to tell me the Jews knew who the Gentiles were more than Peter did? Or was Peter that confused? And after all, where was Peter going? He's going down to Caesarea, which is a, quote, Gentile region dedicated to the pagan king Caesar. Built by Herod the Great, by the way. Fascinating story of that city and what have you. But anyway, so according to the Iowa people, we have to completely redefine these terms. We have to reject the lexical terms. We have to reject what the Old Testament said about God loving the strangers. We have to reject the Old Testament testimony of God inviting strangers to come to the temple and pray and receive blessings. We have to reject the Old Testament testimony that foreigners and strangers could love the Lord, obey the Torah, be circumcised, and become a child of Abraham. We have to reject the story of Trophimus and Paul. And we have to reject Josephus. Everywhere, everywhere that we turn, the evidence is there if we do not close our mind and our heart to that evidence, that while God most assuredly did deal with Israel corporately as a nation, exclusively, for a period of time, he was only dealing with them exclusively for a time to prepare the world and the way so that he could then invite all men of every nation. As Revelation 22 concludes, let whosoever will come. Come what? Come to the city. Come in where the tree of life is. Come in where the water of life is. Well, you know, William, we were actually supposed to continue our discussion here of the signs of the end and continue our discussion of the great apostasy, but somehow or other you got sidetracked. I don't know how that happened.
I think it started with a question from Dunn Preston.
Oh, well, this has been good, but we are out of time. Folks, thank you so very, very much for being with us this evening on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Share the news, share the word, help this program to grow, to reach out, to let people know that there is a God who loves them, there is a God who offers salvation to them, that salvation is in Christ, that salvation is in his body, which never ends, and their salvation never ends. So with that, William, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.